Hi, I'm Samir Jain. I'm going to review this book, White Fragility. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for the last 6-7 months, written by Robin DiAngelo. It's when I picked it up, I thought it would be the usual diversity training manual, but it wasn't. Well, it's not as cerebral as, I guess, Amartya Sen's classic Identity and Violence, which is a very hard read. It isn't as brilliant as Sam Huntington's Who Are We, but it had many aha moments for me, so I thought it's really worth recapping the salient ideas. So she says she's written this book for an essentially white audience, and it talks about why white folks never quite see themselves as racist. In fact, she says they become angry, defensive, or hostile when told that they may be part of a racist system. So it all begins, she says, from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, amongst other things. So all of this made racial prejudice and discrimination against black people a real taboo for most white people. So white folks don't really talk about racism. And to be racially prejudiced was to be associated with the images of the hateful, violent, southern, white, supremacist, KKK type of folks who were viewed as immoral. And of course, to be racially prejudiced is to be discriminatory, which is now illegal. So everyone wants to be a nice, moral person. So one has to avoid being racist. And of course, most white people, they want to see themselves as nice, moral individuals. Nobody sees themselves as racist. And they recoil at any suggestion that they are otherwise. People even say that racial prejudice does exist, but we don't have institutional racism in the US. It doesn't exist anymore. And of course, individuals may be bigoted, but I am not. She then explains like the roots of race thinking. Race isn't a genetic reality. It's not even biological. She says that it's a social construct. It guides people's thoughts and actions. And while designating people as black or white might seem fairly straightforward, there's a lot more below the surface. The reality is key political, economic, social, cultural institutions in the United States, I guess even in Europe, are overwhelmingly controlled by white people, and they have disproportionate share of power. And this power didn't come overnight. This power was accumulated because people of color were enslaved. This power was expropriated. It came through disenfranchising large parts of people. It came from segregation. It came from marginalizing people. So all of us have been socialized by the conditions that have surrounded us. And for white people, they no longer see this as an inherited advantage that plays out every day, but rather something that is natural to the world. So she says that the way we define racism as a personal character trait, is really the wrong way to look at things, because racism doesn't play out that way. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of difference between racism, racial prejudice, and racial discrimination. So being called a racist is being seen as something that is a defamation of character, which she says is really not how we should look at racism. Rather, we should look at it as something that is wielded collectively by those of us who have it against those of us who don't. It is deeply embedded in the social, political, cultural, economic, and legal power structures that define the way we live our lives. So she says that in time, certain social groups have assimilated, and the US law itself has codified whiteness into a form of privileged legal status. So white people over time were entitled to certain things like owning slaves. They had rights of citizenship. They had the right to vote, etc., etc. But what's happened is this construct of racism has accentuated distinctions in underlying social, cultural, political, economic realities. And all of this has created fault lines, and it has created massive disparities that exist to this day. And over the past 1 year, we've seen these disparities come into very sharp relief. So for me, the point here is racism is not just individual racial prejudice and discrimination, but it becomes a real problem because it is a systemic problem. And when you're able to act on prejudice, and that is what creates racism, and when these prejudices flow into societal laws, institutions, policies, norms, when it transcends the individual level, that's when it becomes a big problem. So black people can be prejudiced and they can discriminate against white people, for example, but they cannot be racist against them because of this, what she calls the imbalance of power between two groups. Yeah, so she says that the belief that we are essentially all separate individuals, this deep individuality that is part of the US ethos, who can shape our lives, who can shape our lives' outcomes, and there's no real barriers for anyone. She says this is a false narrative. She debunks individualism. She holds that individuals can, the notion that individuals can determine their own destinies without influence from society, the circumstances into which they were born, or the groups to which they now belong. She says that this is the main, this is one of the important drivers. And the second issue she brings our attention to is meritocracy. This belief that that people can get what they deserve, that is based on the merits of their skills and efforts. The book says that success and advantage in life is not entirely the result of one's own hard work, intelligence, initiative, and because it's so deeply ingrained, white folks don't acknowledge that they have these natural advantages now. And all of this is shaped by history, the society that we've come to form. For example, there's a good example that Bill Gates' kids will always have an advantage over others, irrespective of whatever they do. So whatever happens in the world is shaped by forces beyond one's control, and a lot of these forces are inherited forces. Then there's a lot of history about where racism came. It says that colonists created the concept of race way back in the 1600s as a way to justify the brutal system of exploitation, of expropriation. So if black people were seen as morally and intellectually inferior, then there is really nothing wrong in, and there's nothing immoral to enslave and to kill them. And she says here, and I know it sounds a bit harsh, that white people are socially conditioned from birth to accept and support this notion of white supremacy. And people, of course, claim that they are colorblind. Not that it's a convenient tool, but they do it because it helps them avoid problems of race by simply pretending that these problems don't exist because they don't face them. So race profoundly shapes the experiences, the views, the expectations of everyone in society. And of course, the experiences of people of color are inevitably different, and they are defined by race. So So, a white person who professes to not see race unsurprisingly becomes defensive and agitated when shown the realities of institutional racism. And she says that it is their responsibility to see it because they are a beneficiary of it. It's important that they recognize that. And they have to change it, because just because people of color might hold positions of power in government, we may have had elected black president, doesn't mean that systemic racism has been resolved or it has been eliminated. So while legally sanctioned segregation might be a thing of the past, Americans still are highly segregated in which place they choose to live, to send their children to study. So white people speak to each other, but they very rarely, she says, speak about racial topics. They almost never don't do it explicitly. They don't mention race at all in private conversations because this is seen as race talk. Rather, they do it subtly. When white participants converge, they talk about, for example, negative attributes like crime that is definitionally tied to minorities, to people of color, to this notion of blackness. And this attitude in turn guides white actions. So white Americans tend to leave neighborhoods that are becoming more criminal, citing their desire to send their children to good schools. So a lot of these things are not spoken, but the assumption is that good schools are those that are attended by fewer minorities. So you have white millennials in college settings that frequently tell racist jokes, and all the while persisting in the belief that they are young, that they are more and more open-minded, that the sins of the father should not be visited upon the son, that they are a lot more tolerant when it comes to race. So all of this, she says, leads to enforcing white solidarity in subtle ways in supporting supremacist beliefs and actions. So while white people are able to deny the presence of racism because they treat it as specific behaviors committed by specific people rather than they, so it's essentially a structural problem today. And that structural problem is really manifested in collective acts at the collective level, at the societal level. This whole notion of racism, I had a point here. This whole notion of, racism encoding whiteness as the normal or a standard condition for societal action, the Americanness of people of color, is, for example, always qualified as this guy is an African American or a Latino American or an Asian American. We never say this person is a white American or a Caucasian American. So this notion of whiteness is assumed to be now a standard or normal operating condition, and it is synonymous with white innate identity itself. So of course, lots of people say that no, I mean, I've experienced hardship myself as a white person. But although they may experience hardships in their lives, white people also enjoy certain privileges due to the fact that they are white. We've heard about this white privilege, and white people bristle at that term. What do you mean privilege? I've had it tough too. But regardless of their circumstances, white people, and this is she talking, not me, enjoy certain advantages because of their whiteness that people of color don't enjoy. And one of them is this sense of belonging. Everywhere you look, a white person looks at is really his or her culture. They tend to see other white people. So this has implications in creating systemic racism, which inevitably leads them to reinforce and to develop a racial bias. So white people's worldview tends to reflect the white-centered culture and communities in which they have grown up. It leads them to reproduce these beliefs, often unconsciously, and these worldviews are in a culture that they produce, which perpetuates this viewpoint. So disparities in rates at which men of color, black men, are arrested and sentenced to prison in the statistics appear much higher than white men for comparable crimes. And this book, the name of the book is White Fragility. It reinforces racism by preventing it from being challenged. By when we examine and address these problems, when we discuss these problems, when we say that white fragility plays a major role in reinforcing racism, that's the only way to tackle racism, not by going into a diversity workshop. Because if you can't solve a problem, you can't solve a problem if you can't even admit that it exists, let alone talk about it in some length. So she has a lot of actionable advice, or what she says is actionable, which is really about embracing one's discomfort with whenever the topic of racism is raised. So if you're a white person, keep in mind the true nature of racism next time your beliefs, your words, your actions are questioned. Or if someone who doesn't really understand you or the topic casts you fleetingly as a racist. She says it's not about you being a bad person or doing a bad thing. It's about you being born and raised in a systematically racist society. And this brings certain inescapable consequences, such as racial biases, white privilege, the way others perceive you. So one should use every occasion as an opportunity to examine, reassess, to change one's behavior and the way of seeing the world, because it is only those who are in power, even if it makes them uncomfortable. That's the point, feeling comfortable about the topic of racism, or worse, feeling entitled to feeling comfortable about it, is yet another aspect of preserving white privilege. So this was an interesting book. I don't necessarily agree with her conclusions or many things that she says, but it brings this topic front and center. So these two books, White Fragility and Amartya Sen's Identity and Violence, are pretty topical books that it's really worth visiting. Thank you so much for listening in. Bye bye.